So this panel, this discussion is about asking who's responsible or who should pay for the consequences, the death, damage, and destruction from human-caused climate change. And if you read or read perhaps New York Times Magazine, you saw a big magnum opus earlier in August where the critically acclaimed novelist Nathaniel Rich said it's all of us, and that we all collectively ourselves are responsible, and that human nature is to blame. Oops, the Berkeley hiss. But some other folks have got a different idea, including the city and county of San Francisco, actually 12 jurisdictions across the country, from Boulder, Colorado, to the state of Rhode Island, to the city of Baltimore, to King County, Washington, have now filed lawsuits against the major oil and gas companies, saying that they, in fact, are responsible, that they have a disproportionate share of culpability, that they should pay some of the costs of the loss and damages associated with climate change. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is those cases and how they all work out. And we've got a really great panel of folks here to walk us through both the legal angles, the scientific angles, and then sort of the grassroots popular civic angles of all this. We'll have a conversation with these folks for about 60 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions, comments, statements, polemics from all of you, and so that we can have a real discussion. So who do we have here? This is Dr. Christina Dahl. She's with the Union of Concerned Scientists, who's been organizing all the activities here today, and she's the senior climate scientist in the Climate and Energy Program there at Union of Concerned Scientists. Yvonne Murray is with the City Attorney's Office and the City and County of San Francisco, and she's got a fantastic title. It is Senior Attorney for Complex and Affirmative Litigation. You get that right? So not simple and passive litigation, complex and affirmative litigation, and she's been among the attorneys handling the city and county's lawsuit against the major carbon polluters, and she'll talk about that. Stephen Feit, he's with the he's a staff attorney with the Climate and Energy Program at the Center for International Environmental Law in Washington, D.C. He'll also explore some of the legal angles outside of the lawsuits here in California. And then May Boovy is the executive director and one of the co-founders of 350.org, which I hope needs no introduction among this room, which of course is the grassroots international climate movement demanding bold action on climate change. So thank you guys all for coming here. So Yvonne, let's start with you, because you've been handling one of these cases. So I guess the question is, why exactly did the city and county decide to sue these major carbon polluters, 5 of the largest oil and gas firms, and demanding compensation or restitution for climate change impacts?
San Francisco is a coastal city, as you all know, and coastal cities across the country are going to be subject to the now irreversible consequences of global warming. So it's not a question of whether or not San Francisco needs to be reimbursed. We know there's going to be damage. We know sea level is going to rise. And we know that San Francisco is going to have to take action to prevent and to adapt to those changing conditions. And so San Francisco has 2 choices. One is to pay for that damage. But it's damage that San Francisco in and of itself didn't cause, right? Fossil fuel companies, it's an agreed upon principle that fossil fuel companies are the primary sources of greenhouse emissions, and that they are significant contributors to global warming. So the law is many things, but in some ways it's crude in its remedies, right? Lawsuits can bring you change to things, and it can bring you money for things. And that's kind of about it. So we as lawyers need to think we have a problem. San Francisco didn't create it, but San Francisco's going to bear the effects of it. So the question is whether or not San Francisco should have explored holding those who are responsible or who are chiefly responsible for those conditions answerable. And we clearly chose yes, and that's why we filed our case. Now, my boss is Dennis Herrera, and he is a man. He's a city attorney of San Francisco. He's a man known for being bold. He's held office more than 15 years, and he has been at the forefront of our marriage litigation, our challenges to the administration, and he takes cases that he believes are right and just. And we don't always win out of the box, and here we did not. We were dismissed in our climate change complaint by federal judge William Alsup. We are on appeal. We feel like this is a righteous case to push forward. We are not alone. We filed our case with the City of Oakland. As you said, there are many other cases across the country. But at some point, you have to ask yourself whether or not something is so important and will cause a city like San Francisco such cost and damage, whether or not it is worth it to try to hold those who are responsible to answer for the conditions that they created. That's kind of a long way of saying that's why we filed.
No, that was a great answer. Thank you so much, Yvonne, for sharing that. We're going to come back to in a little bit, like the actual particular, the practicalities of how and sort of the legal doctrines of your case. But let's talk about the damages. And so, Unit of Concerned Scientists, you all published a report called Underwater: Rising Seas, Chronic Floods, and the Implications for U.S. Coastal Real Estate. And I wonder if you could talk about what that showed and how it relates to cases like those from the city and county of San Francisco, city of Oakland, and some of the other California municipalities. It also includes, right, there's other cases, County of Marin, County of San Mateo. So what did you all find when you looked at the consequences of rising sea levels?
Sure. So we first started looking at sea level rise as an issue and a threat to our country. We started looking at it about 5 years ago in terms of really dedicating research energy to it. And when we started to do that research, we came at it with the attitude that a lot of people have towards sea level rise, which was that it was going to be a threat that we really wouldn't be truly facing until much later in the century. And the more we started to dig into the data, the more we realized that long before our homes or roads are underwater with every high tide, they're going to be experiencing much more frequent nuisance level flooding. So this is, you've probably seen pictures of this. You know, Miami Beach is sort of the epicenter, and that's the place that makes the news all the time. There are places here in the Bay Area where every time there's an extra high tide, maybe at a new moon or a full moon, there are stretches of road that flood. So we started to really want to quantify how extensive this flooding would be, how frequent it would be, and how disruptive it would be in the near term. So in our most recent report, you can see some results here. What we're showing is the number of homes that are at risk of flooding chronically. That means flooding on average every other week due to sea level rise by the end of the century. And so these are the places that have filed lawsuits. The city of San Francisco, by the end of the century, would be looking at over 4,000 homes at risk of this chronic flooding, whereas places like San Mateo County, we're looking at over 30,000 homes at risk. So this is an enormous challenge. Nationwide, we found that by the end of the century, there are almost 2.5 million homes at risk of this chronic flooding. And the total dollar value tops $1 trillion when you look at it all together. So that really does come into play when we think about how we're going to prepare for this enormous nationwide challenge. It's going to take a lot of financial resources. And so it does beg the question of where is that money going to come from? Right now, essentially, we all as taxpayers are sharing that burden. And so it's a fair question to ask whether, as Yvonne just said, those who are most responsible for producing those greenhouse gases should also be held to account.
It's really interesting. I just did a story for The Nation magazine. There's some copies out there. And I was talking to Sheldon Whitehouse, the senator from Rhode Island. He said, this stuff is really going to come to a head when sea level rise starts to intrude on the horizon of the 30-year mortgage. But like we're already there in some places, right? I mean, the 30-year mortgage is whatever, 2048. And so this I mean, what about other homes in other places that are not on this map? Yeah, like Broward County or Florida. How many homes there?
Absolutely. In that 30-year time frame, we specifically looked at that because we wanted with real estate, you want some sort of time frame that people can really wrap their heads around. So we chose the 30-year mortgage time frame. And just in that time frame, there are over 300,000 homes at risk that are today worth a collective nearly $120 billion.
So it's one thing to say, okay, global sea levels are rising due to anthropogenic causes, and we get that. But then it's another thing to connect the dot and say these companies are responsible. So Stephen, your organization, you guys put out a report called Smoke and Fumes. And I think following up on some of the work that had been done by Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times and others with these Exxon new revelations. So what did you find, and how does that help kind of connect the dots between saying, okay, there's this harm, but is there really a perpetrator that we can point to?
Sure. So if you don't know, for the past 5 or so years, CL has been trying to do research to answer 3 basic questions. What did the oil industry know about climate change? When did it know it? And what did it do with that information? And we could spend a lot of time going into the timeline, but there are 5 key takeaways. First, spoilers, they knew. They knew early. They were doing active research into climate science at least as early as 1957, but it wasn't isolated. They continued to do that research both through their individual companies and through coordinated industry research organizations, to the present day. But then in addition to just the climate research, they also had the necessary expertise to understand the context and the importance of what they were seeing. They researched hurricane formation and forecasting. They looked into paleoclimates, historical sea levels and carbon concentrations in the atmosphere and the way that those interacted with historic temperatures so that they could find oil offshore because they needed to know where it developed and where it was. They were extremely, extremely coordinated, more than any other industry except maybe tobacco, which was modeled after oil. They operated as a unit. It's not that they didn't compete at all, but they really understood that the importance to their bottom line was to collaborate against regulation rather than to fight each other over a little market share. And you can see this in internal company and industry documents where they are talking about the need and the imperative to share information and to join communal pots of money to fund research as opposed to doing it all on their own. So again, they're all coordinated, a lot of expertise, knew about climate change. They also knew of the alternatives, the ways that we didn't have to go down this path. They, since the 40s, were studying carbon sequestration from gas streams, originally for enhanced oil recovery, but also, notably, they acknowledged it could be used to remove carbon dioxide from gas stacks and exhaust pipes for the purpose of mitigating climate change. They were looking into solar patents. By the end of the 70s, basically all the US solar industry was owned by the oil industry. And we know what happened with that, very little for a very long time. They were looking into electric vehicles and fuel cells, all of these things that they, as opposed to deploying, developing, and allowing the public to choose to take a different path, they took all this technology and mostly just sat on it. And then finally, as we know, they denied. Once the science got reasonably certain, they started saying things very differently in public than they would in private. Exxon, around the turn of the century, started publishing these advertorials, being very equivocal about what the science actually said, how certain it was, and how dangerous it would be, whereas in their private communications, they acknowledged how serious it was. They funded all these dark money groups. They funded scientists discreetly whose work had been discredited, but who didn't disclose that they were being funded by the oil industry, and the list goes on. And then finally, just one more point. They incorporated, while they were doing the denial, while they were obfuscating, confusing everyone, they incorporated their understanding of climate change into their operational planning. There are at least 2 good examples in 1986 and 1989 of Exxon and Shell, respectively, acknowledging that the Arctic, with all of its ice and permafrost, was going to physically change over the time span of the projects that they wanted to construct there, and that they needed to build that into the plans.
And Berkeley hiss. They can hear you all the way in Irving, Texas. May, I'd love to hear from you how you, from your perspective, is, and having a really sort of, view from kind of a movement leader perspective, how does this fit together with the other actions and activities we're seeing to challenge the corporate actors? So specifically, I'm thinking about the divestment campaign, the fossil fuel divestment campaign that 350 is led so wonderfully, and then also like the Keep It in the Ground movement, so the campaigns against pipelines and coal trains and oil trains. How does this litigation and these now new pressure on the carbon barons and the carbon polluters. Well, how does it fit in?
Yeah, thanks, Jason, and thanks so much, Janet, for organizing all of us here in Fossil Free California. And I just want to say, no matter how many times I hear this story, it makes me so angry every time. I can feel my blood boiling whenever this is relayed. And I think that's precisely the point, is that all of these pieces are part of the puzzle of painting the picture about what this industry has known and done. And every social movement in history has had a known villain. And I think the climate movement was a little slow in capturing this narrative in a way that people could respond and do something about. But the lawsuits are yet another nail in the coffin of making that argument, that there's another piece of evidence now about what this industry is doing, and it's starting to get at what can actually be done about it, and how can justice be done at a very fundamental level. If right now, so many cities around the world are having to pay for the damages of climate change, just as you said, for a problem that they largely did not cause. At a certain point, the public purse should not be used for these expenses. There is someone who caused it, and they should pay. So I think that the lawsuits help people understand what's at stake in a new way. And I think in the climate fight, we always need new ways of doing that, because the problem can seem diffuse, it can seem complex, and I think when you start to understand who's causing climate change, who's being affected, and who is being held to account, it starts to hold together. And so in terms of its connection to other pieces of the struggle, you have, right here in the Bay Area, I think it's a really good example. You have oil refineries in Richmond, in Benicia, in Martinez, so you have community groups fighting extraction right here. You have community groups fighting the construction of a new export terminal, so not only the extraction and the burning taking place in the Bay Area, but also the process to get those products out to market. You have the city suing the oil companies, and then you have numerous other players in the Bay Area divesting. So you even, and this is not unique to the Bay Area, there's a lot of places around the world where this combination of strategies is being used. And I think it's helping the movement build political power, and I think it's helping people understand what can be done. And I think the reason it's important to have a known target or villain in the social movement is that when it comes to understanding the climate issue, we know we're all responsible individually, right? Like we know that, we can accept that. We understand that our individual actions contribute to this problem and that our individual actions can be part of the solution. But that can be so demobilizing, and that has been so effectively used by industry to get people to do nothing. And it's important to demonstrate that these are much larger systemic problems at play and big political and economic systems that have to shift. And that's also going to require individual action, right? It's going to require organizing, mobilizing, like what many of us did on Saturday. So I just want to make that point more firmly about why this is needed, because of how people can feel stuck when it comes to what they do about climate change.
So okay, we've got all these impacts, and we sort of knew that the villains and the bastards knew, right? But then how do you really apportion blame, right? I mean, how do you really, if you've got this pie of total greenhouse gas emissions from all of human history, how do we decide this part goes to ExxonMobil and this part goes to Chevron and this part goes to Shell? So I'd love it, Christina, or maybe Stephen, let's maybe start with Christina. Talk a little bit about what's now known as attribution science. Like, what does attribution science mean, and why is it so important for the cases from San Francisco and other places?
So attribution science is a really fascinating and rapidly evolving field. Just even a few years ago, there wasn't really a scientific consensus that it was legitimate. But increasingly, we've found methods and processes and models that help us to attribute specific amounts of carbon dioxide to climate impacts. So more broadly, you've probably seen some of these attribution studies when you read in the news that things like Hurricane Harvey were made 15% more likely by human-caused climate change. That without that fingerprint of human emissions, the sort of devastating rains that occurred during Hurricane Harvey wouldn't have happened. So when it comes to attributing specific amounts of warming and sea level rise to individual fossil fuel emitters, that was something that some of my colleagues at UCS did in a really groundbreaking study last year, where they built on this incredible database that a scientist named Rick Heady had developed. And what Heady did is he went into like the dust bins of all of the oil companies and all their old libraries, dug up all the records about what they had extracted. And then he was able to calculate from that how much CO2 in our atmosphere was directly attributable to the products of individual oil companies and fossil fuel companies, cement companies. So my colleagues at UCS then took that and they said, okay, this is the amount of CO2 that is attributable to these particular companies. How much warming does that cause? And how much sea level rise does that cause? So I have one more graphic, if we could just advance. Very simply, you'll see this bar chart crop up. And so looking at temperature on in the orange bar and sea level rise globally in the yellow bar, you can see that about 16% of the amount of temperature increase we've experienced since the late 1800s is attributable to about 50 fossil fuel companies. And about 10% or 11% of the global sea level rise we've experienced in that time period is attributable to these companies. We can get even more fine-grained than that. We can distill it down to just the 7 largest oil companies. And I'm going to just peek at my notes because this is a lot of numbers. But when we look at just the 7 largest oil companies, we see that about 10% of the air temperature increase is attributable to those companies, and about 8% of the global sea level rise. So we can get really fine-grained about what portion of these climate impacts the fossil fuel industry is responsible for. And that is hopefully something that can feed into these lawsuits to say, okay, they're not responsible for all of it, right? We, as May was just saying, we are all responsible for it. And yet, as Stephen was saying, we weren't given any choice, right? And so while, yes, we all will pay to some extent, there is a need for those who are most responsible to pay as well.
You have to say it's really stunning on this second graphic. You can't totally see it because you don't go out to the present, but is to think about the fact that in the 30 years since Dr. James Hansen first brought this issue to widespread public attention with his testimony in Congress in the summer of 1988. In the last 30 years, half of all human greenhouse gas emissions have happened. So it's like if we had taken action then, we would have avoided potentially half or some significant portion of all the impacts.